The title for our study in Ecclesiastes is The Solitary Man. And this evening we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, specifically the entire chapter, beginning in verse 1 and going all the way through to verse 16. Now, before we get there, just a few words of refreshment or review as we come back after over a month of pause from our study. I've said it before that the book of Ecclesiastes serves really as a commentary on the consequences of Adam's fall. Ecclesiastes serves as a commentary on the consequences of the fall of humanity into sin. What Ecclesiastes does is it forces us to come to terms with life outside the garden. We do not live in paradise. We live outside the garden in a world that is sinful, a world that is cursed, a world that is broken, and a world that is in need of redemption. There are many parallels in the book of Ecclesiastes to the third chapter of Genesis, to the account of man's fall. We could look, for example, at Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 to 19, where the Lord pronounces this curse on Adam. He says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." And the book of Ecclesiastes really expounds on that reality over and over again. And this brokenness that we understand and we experience in this life outside of the garden is particularly manifested in human relationships. And that is what Ecclesiastes chapter 4 focuses on. It focuses on the impact of the fall on human relations. It's as Job said in Job 5, verse 7, "For man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward," and that is manifest particularly in the strife that we experience in the human race. And again, when we look back to the opening chapters of Genesis and look really for the foundation for the book of Ecclesiastes, we find the foundation of Ecclesiastes 4 in Genesis 4. Turn there for just a moment. Genesis 4 is that shocking chapter of the first familial disaster. It's that shocking chapter where we read of the relationship between Cain and Abel and how that results in the first murder. Let me begin reading in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 4, where we read this. "So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it.' Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is Abel your brother?' And he said, 'I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?' He said, 'What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground.' Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you, and you will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me from this day, from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. What we find in that first relationship disaster, we find all the elements that we will find in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We will find violence. We will find pride, selfishness, envy, disloyalty, fickleness, all of the same things that are manifest in Cain's fallen relationship with his brother will come to the forefront in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, Solomon laments the state of human relations, the broken, sin-stained state of human relations. He reflects on the reality that not only has sin created this antisocial effect vertically with respect to God, but it has also created this antisocial, this kind of corrosive nature in a horizontal way with everyone around sinful man. And in the same way that Cain is left at the end of this account solitary, a wanderer, a vagrant as he's called there, so also this is what sin does to man's relationships. Leaves him isolated, leaves him ostracized, leaves him alone. So one of the common experiences of our reality in this world outside the garden is that of solitude in a negative sense, of loneliness. And Solomon is now going to bring this out in the book of Ecclesiastes in 4 different scenes that show us that sin leaves man solitary. It leaves him alone in loneliness. And we're going to see this in terms of 4 laments. First of all, the first lament comes in the first 3 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 4. And it's a lament over human indifference. This is one of the results of the fall, human indifference. Ecclesiastes 4, 1-3, Solomon writes, Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which are being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them, speaking again of the oppressed. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. Solomon begins by looking at the brokenness of human relationships in the context of authority structures. He bases his conclusions on what is observable to human experience. Notice how he begins. He says, Then I looked again. He is referring here to what is commonly, openly observable, even on a daily basis. And he bases his conclusion on that which is ubiquitous. It's not something that is limited to a certain class. It's not something that is limited to a certain geographical region or ethnicity. Instead, he looks at all the acts, verse 1, all the acts which were being done under the sun. And central to this observation, as he studied the relationship between those who have authority and those who don't, he observes the reality of oppression. And notice this, he says at the end of verse 1, he says, he repeats the word oppression and oppressed and oppressors, the root word 3 times to show us that this is his focus. He says he looked at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they, the oppressed, had no one to comfort them. The primary focus of Solomon's observation here is the political sphere, but what he's referring to certainly extends to all spheres of human relationships. Human depravity corrupts the exercise of authority, turning relationships into this constant struggle for power and subjugation. It's everywhere. To one degree or another, in this world outside of the garden, every relationship is defined by this jockeying for position, of trying to find the upper hand and then using that position in a way to subjugate others for the benefit of oneself. That is the common human experience. And like Solomon says, this is not limited to a certain region. This is not limited to a certain ethnicity. It defines human relationships. In fact, we could say this, that devoid of the fear of God, even when this corruption is recognized, apart from the fear of God, every effort that attempts to rectify the problem only intensifies it. It only intensifies the corruption that exists. You just look at the BLM movement. And this movement that supposedly is to bring equity is rife with some of the worst corruption that you'd ever see in capitalism. Apart from the fear of God, any effort to correct the problem only intensifies it. Because as we'll see as we go through this book, the only solution that there is to this problem of sin's corrupting influence outside of the garden is to look to the redemption that's found in the fear of the Lord. Now, what's interesting in this particular text is that Solomon looks at the issue of injustices a little differently than how he has looked at them before. Back in chapter 3, if you remember back to our previous study, we looked at chapter 3, and in verses 16 to 17, Solomon takes a big picture approach. He really looks at the problem from above. And he says this in verses 16 and 17. He says, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there is wickedness, and in the place of righteousness there is wickedness. And I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter, and for every deed is there. There, back in chapter 3, Solomon takes that satellite view and looks at things in terms of the big picture. But here in chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, he looks from within it. He is focused on the here and now and laments a certain kind of reality that marks many of these situations of oppression and injustice. Notice what he says in the second half of verse 1. He said, and behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they, that is the oppressed, had no one to comfort them. For the sake of emphasis, what Solomon does here, what he's really focused on here in terms of analyzing this situation, he's focused on the solitude of the one being sinned against here. Twice he repeats it. They had no one to comfort them. In the world outside of the garden, even the tears of an oppressed man garner no sympathy. This is the reality. The oppressed man so often is all alone, surrounded by indifference. People just don't care. And that's what Solomon is focusing on. Certainly, he already knows those acts of injustice will be judged, but his heart, in a great level of sympathy here, goes out to those who suffer and have no one to comfort them. Now, to emphasize the shocking nature of this reality, Solomon employs a better than statement. You know of these from the book of Proverbs. He uses them frequently there, and he's going to use one here now in verses 2 and 3. And it's interesting to consider the comparison, the better than comparison that he uses. First of all, he congratulates in this symbolic way. Of course, he's not talking literally. He's speaking proverbially. He congratulates symbolically the dead. Why? Because they're done with it. They no longer will be oppressed. They no longer will experience that injustice. They will no longer will witness it. And that is a good place to be, Solomon says. To be done with what is ubiquitous on this planet. But more than that, he says that those who have never been born are better off still. Those who have never experienced this kind of injustice, those who have never witnessed it, are still better off. Now, that kind of language may seem strange to us. Wouldn't Solomon realize the benefit of existence, particularly after this life? Why does he say that the best are those who have never been born? Well, what Solomon is doing here is using a kind of hyperbole that is common elsewhere. We could look at it in Job, the book of Job. Job will often say this, and we'll see it also in Jeremiah. You could look at Jeremiah chapter 20, verses 14 to 18, where it's found there too, that when one is confronted with the ugliness of evil, it is so astounding that one wishes that he had never, ever seen it before. And yet this world is full of it from the very first moments of existence. And so Solomon in that hyperbole says, I wish, or I congratulate the most those who have never experienced. This is so evil. He laments the indifference of human beings to each other. And you just need to take some time to listen to the news or to talk with neighbors, to hear stories, and then you will find indeed how ubiquitous this is. Over and over you can hear stories of people who have suffered and had no one to comfort. A second lament is a lament over human envy. A lament over human envy, and this begins in verse 4 and goes to verse 6. This is another aspect of the corrosive nature of sin and its impact that it has on human relations. Not only does it make man indifferent to the plight of others, but envy corrodes us so that we're willing ourselves to step on others in order to get ahead. This is what he says in verses 4 to 6. His lament over human envy. He says, I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and a striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One hand full of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after the wind. What is Solomon describing here? Now he moves from the context of authority structures to the sphere of labor. Now he's talking about the relationships of men within the context of work. He once again says that what he observes is not some isolated incident. Rather, this is something that is easily observable as one just has eyes to see what's taking place around him. And he expresses the result of his observation in very definitive forms. Notice how absolute Solomon is as he describes this. He says in verse 4, every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. And he follows this with another summary statement. This too is vapor. This too is striving after the wind, trying to catch the wind. it doesn't have any lasting value. Now, what Solomon is subtly pointing to here is that what should motivate us to work, what should motivate us to succeed, what should motivate us even to prosper, should be in large degree our love for our neighbor. In fact, when you look at the law, the Mosaic law, and all the stipulations that are added, as Jesus himself said, that one of the pegs of one of the two pegs of the entire Mosaic law is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that extends to how we are to look at work. Work can never be viewed as something simply I do for myself. Instead, work is to be motivated by a love for our neighbor. But let's face it, men, as we think of what gets us up early in the morning and what keeps us up late at night and what gives us that energy that we need sometimes to get through the day is not necessarily a love for neighbor. What it is often is a love to be better than our neighbor, a desire to look better, a desire to have more, a desire to be at a higher tier, to be the best on the block, to be the best in the office, to have the best portfolio. And all of those assessments are made in comparison to others. In fact, we could say this: in a world outside the garden, it is prevalent that envy fuels the economy. You just look at what takes place in the world today. Envy fuels this world's economy. One writer has put it this way: mortals can be as cruel and inhuman to each other in unnecessary competition as they can be in outright oppression. Often the rule of the business world is the law of the jungle. In other words, Solomon has first looked at the injustices that take place within authority structures. And those injustices can be everything from very formal persecution to the subtle injustices that take place in the home. As marriages face that power struggle and workplaces face that power struggle, there's always the potential for oppression. But now he's looking at it and saying, listen, there is something as corrosive as that power struggle, and that is the motivation of envy. Envy has long been considered one of the chief sins. We call it one of the 7 deadly sins. It's manifest in that idea that anything you can do, I can do better. Anything that you have, I deserve more. Any applause, any promotion, any affirmation, I should get more. And as a result, even among friends, the successes of others are very painful things to digest. That's the reality of so many relationships. Listen, we can actually come alongside someone who is suffering quite easily. We can recognize that they've fallen and they need help. There's the tears of the oppressed, and we can come alongside. But if that same person has succeeded, if that same person has received something more than us, we fail to rejoice when they rejoice. Indeed, we can find it so much easier to mourn with those who mourn than to rejoice with those who rejoice. And again, it is a manifestation of the same kind of sin that was present in Genesis chapter 4 and Cain's murder of Abel. Another writer puts it this way: when we look at the broken, fallen world through a biblical lens, what we see is that the world is a place where our neighbor can be damned so long as we can be king. It's a place where we often relentlessly pursue the neighbor above us by willingly stepping on the head of the neighbor beneath us, when we pursue gain because we think that's all there is to be had, others are going to get hurt. That's what happens. And after stating this chief observation, Solomon again goes to some proverbial expressions here in verses 5 and 6. First of all, he does recognize an exception. As Solomon describes how envy motivates so many people, he does recognize an exception, but it's only a superficial exception. The root problem is still there. He says this in verse 5, the fool folds his hand and consumes his own flesh. Now, the folding of the hands, we know from the book of Proverbs, is what describes the indolent, lazy sluggard, the one who refuses to work, who just wants to receive. And the idea of consuming the flesh is the idea of this paradox that the man who's lazy actually consumes himself. His refusing to work is because he loves himself so much. And yet in that self-love, he systematically destroys himself through his laziness. And what Solomon acknowledges through this particular parable or proverb is that the issue is not work itself. The issue is not labor. The issue is motivation. A lazy man who refuses to work is just as evil as the man motivated by envy. And we need to emphasize that, especially today. Because again, as the different cultural influences make their way through the society, one of them is that it's better not to work, and that those who are working are the evil ones. They've got all the money, they've got all the power, they've got all the stuff. We should all have access equally to it, even if I don't want to work. Well, Solomon would say that if you refuse to work, if your objective in life is to live off the charity of others, be that informally or formally, if you just refuse to work, you don't want to provide for yourself and for others, you're just as evil as the one who works only to serve himself and to put down his neighbor. Work is not the problem, motivation is. And Solomon then returns to the issue of envy in the next proverb that he gives in verse 6, related to this issue, when he says another better than saying. He says this, one hand full of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving. The problem, verse 5, was too little ambition, not enough effort to love the neighbor, so much focus on self. The problem in verse 6 is still so much focus on self, but too much ambition. Too much ambition. And the rest that he's referring to, that one hand should always have rest, what he's referring to there is the virtue of contentment. Solomon believes that for there to be balance, there must be this contentment. One of the two hands that we have been given, and understand the hands as the tools for labor. One of the two hands that we have been given should always be full of contentment, even as the other hand labors. And that is the secret to balance. And that is much better, he says, than having two hands grasping that labor, being successful, and doing everything for yourself. You see, what he points to here, what is so very important, and we all know this, is that contentment is such a balm to relationships. There are few things as constructive in a man's life to the relationships that he has around him with his wife, with his children, with his neighbors, with his co-workers, with anyone that he comes across. There's few things as constructive as contentment, as this rest. It is the solution to this particular problem that Solomon emphasizes. Again, David Gibson puts it this way, it is the two-handed toiling for wealth as an end in itself that is a root of evil. It grows like a strangling vine around the heart and the harm spreads its tentacles in several different directions at once. Or as Solomon himself said in Psalm 127, verse 2, it is vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread of painful labors. Now here's the contentment. For he, that is Yahweh, gives to his beloved even in his sleep. Number 3, a third scene here. A lament over human selfishness. We've seen the first lament over human indifference. The second lament was over envy. Now it's over self-centeredness, just plain old selfishness. And we find this in verses 7 to 12. He begins first with another declaration. He says this in verse 7. He says, then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. He continues, indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity and a grievous task. Now, Solomon transitions from first having dealt with authority structures and corrosive relationships there due to sin, then to the workplace, and now he's speaking more specifically about family. And it's not really about marriage. Even when we get into the next part of this particular paragraph, it's often been used to refer to marriage. He's not specifically referring to marriage. He's rather looking at family. And he looks again around the world, and he sees this common problem. And what he sees is this. There was a certain man, without any dependence. He had neither son nor a brother, no one to take care of. And yet there was no end to all his labors. The man he describes is one so focused on self-promotion that he had no time to cultivate relationships. So focused on taking care of himself, he has no one else to care for. And let me tell you something, men, for us as men in particular, we have been designed to care for others. We have been designed, we have been uniquely manufactured by our Creator to care for others. It is part of that original DNA. But the man that is being described here by Solomon has no one to care for. And so he even gets to the end of his life. He's never been satisfied by all that he's received, the riches, the wealth, the success. None of that has taken the place of that need, that desire to care for others. And he asks himself when it's too late, for whom am I laboring? Solomon's assessment is this. This too is a vanity and a grievous task. His selfishness, this particular man's selfishness, has blinded the man's eyes from seeing the bigger picture. And by the time he gets to the end of life and realizes not only has he not cared for anyone else, but there's no one now who cares about him. And he asks the question, for what reason? He can't produce offspring. He's too old. His brothers are gone. They don't care about him. He is left alone. And what Solomon reminds us here is this, that the fruit of our labors and the fruit of our successes is to be enjoyed also by others. If in your work and business and in your careers and in what you do as those who have been designed to work and create, made in God's image, if all those fruits of your labors are only being enjoyed by yourself, you've got it all wrong. And I realize it's counterintuitive. We always think because of sin's impact on us, we've got to protect, we've got to collect, we've got to save, we've got to store. It's for me. I've got to protect this bubble. I've got to protect this nest egg. I've got to protect this paycheck. And we go through life that way and realize that God created us to work, yes, but he created us to share the fruit of our labor with others, and it is through that we really come to enjoy labor as God has intended it. When it is enjoyed only by ourselves, it is poison. William Barrick states, preoccupied with climbing the corporate ladder, a man often tells himself that he does so in order to take care of his family. But in reality, he's caught up in his projects to make a name for himself. His family soon becomes a casualty due to his neglect for their real welfare. Or as another man put it very concisely, money is their only kin. And men, let me challenge you. If you're single, the problem of many young men today is this. It's the mentality that I'm going to first go out and be successful. I'm going to build my business. I'm going to get my education and get a career. I'm going to buy that house and have everything settled. And then I'm going to go and make a family. I'm going to find a woman to marry and then have children. And we've got it all wrong. That family is not some later idea, some kind of capstone to all of your successes, but family is the bedrock to it. You need that environment with which to share the fruit of your labors. You've been created to do that. So stop putting off marriage. Get married and get married young. And then you men who are married, you fall into that trap of thinking just one more month of hard work, one more month, or one more year, or I just need to get to retirement. I've heard that before. Talked to a man some time ago whose marriage was failing and his children were in strife with him. And he was working way too many hours. And when I asked him, challenged him on it, his response was, I just need to get to retirement. Well, when's retirement? 5 years from now. Brother, you will not have a family in 5 years. You are deceived. Men, don't live that life that we've heard before of the man who gets to his deathbed, has no one around him as he's dying, and then he says he wishes he could have spent more time with his family. No one ever says, I wish I spent more time in the office. You are created to work and to share the fruit of your labors with others. Now, what Solomon does here, and we'll go through this very quickly, what Solomon does here is that he provides a series of other proverbial expressions now that help us realize the importance of having others around us, the importance of sharing life, of not being that solitary man. It's one thing to be that solitary man when oppressors do that to you. But it's another thing to create a lifestyle in which you've chosen the path of solitude, to be a vagrant on your own accord. So first, he's got a series of 4 expressions here. First, he says this, 2 are better than 1, verses 9 and 10. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them fails, then one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there's not another to lift him up. The solitary man is helpless in times of emergency. When you fall into the pit, if you have not cultivated relationships, if you've not shared of your life, you find yourself all alone at the bottom of the pit. Solomon says, make friends. You'll need them. Accidents will happen. Secondly, he says, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Now, here in Southern California, we don't really understand this proverb. Although some of you look at the weather out there now and think it's cold. I think it's beautiful. This is ideal weather. But in the ancient Near East, you had very cold evenings. And especially when you traveled or if you had to work outside through the night or stay away from home, it would get cold and you didn't have those nice down sleeping bags. And so it was customary that those who were working together and who had to stay overnight in a location without proper heating, that they would sleep close together and share body heat. And that's the point of the proverb here. A solitary man will suffer pain and loss in the case of hardship. But a companion, those whom you've shared life with, a companion is able to share with you then in the time of need. A third proverb here, he says this: if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. Now the picture is that of traveling along the road and having robbers come upon you. In that case, the solitary man will suffer defeat in the case of an attack, but having a friend with you, a companion, will be there to help you in the moment of threat. Fourthly, he says, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. Here, he now says, you know what? There's strength even in more. You know what? Get a companion. Cultivate a friendship, a loyal friend. But you know what? If you can add another one to that, it's even better. There's strength in numbers, and companionship brings great benefit. And what is positive here as Solomon steps away from all the negative observations about life outside the garden is this: he points us to what is still a manifestation of the goodness of God that we still can enjoy in this world, and that is the blessing of companionship. Men, make friends. Fourthly, very quickly, a lament over human disloyalty. A lament over human disloyalty. I'll read the text and go through it very quickly. Our time is out. But this is what he says in verses 13 to 16 as he laments fickleness or disloyalty. He says, a poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born a poor in this kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side then of a second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people who all who were before them, and even to the ones who will come later, who will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after the wind. Solomon now returns to the realm of politics. And this is a difficult text, but I'll go through it quickly. The overall message is clear, and it's this: the masses are fickle. In other words, though there is strength to be found in numbers, don't get carried away. Don't think you need popularity. Don't think you need the big crowds of friends around you, because the bigger that number becomes, the more fickle they become. Solomon has said this previously in Proverbs 18:24. A man of too many friends comes to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Solomon uses a story to show how fickle people are in the change of leadership. There's several stages. First of all, an old king, but he's grown to the point where he no longer listens to his people. He doesn't care. Well, his insensitivity leads to discontent. And so stage 2 is the poor but wise young man who himself comes out of prison. And he becomes king. Why? He's learned wisdom. And even though he was born into this humiliating social status, his wisdom, in a good sense, has made him appealing to the people. But that's not the end. Here's the problem. There's disloyalty. Stage 3. He then says in verse 15, I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. This second lad replaces the poor young man who is wise, who ascended after the old king, but he's only there for a while. And you know what? The fickle crowds, the masses, they're on to something new. They've given up on this young, wise man, and now they're after somebody popular, and they want to make him king. But you know what? Even their support wanes. Notice verse 16. There is no end to all the people, to all who are before them, and even to the ones who will come after, who will not be happy, even with him. Even with that third guy, who replaced the wise guy, who replaced the old, stupid king. The crowds just moved back and forth. Solomon's point is this: the masses are fickle and unfaithful. And it reflects what Solomon said in Proverbs 20, verse 6. Many a man proclaims his own loyalty, but a trustworthy man who can find? It's the problem of fickleness, unfaithfulness, and it's particularly manifested in large crowds. Solomon's saying, look, don't look for those large crowds. You need to find a few faithful men. Those are your friends. And as we wrap it up, what kind of application can we bring to this? The key is what Solomon built all of this upon was not just the reality of this fallen world, but also the law of God. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's what Leviticus 19:18 says. John the apostle repeats this in 1 John 3:11-12. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was, because of the evil one, and slew his own brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. So what do we do in light of Solomon's exhortations? For those who fear the Lord, what do we do? First of all, put off indifference, put on compassion. Care for people. That is a manly trait. Sympathy, the ability to comfort those who mourn. Put that on. And in the midst of that, consider your own authority and ensure that you are not the cause of another's tears. Put on compassion. Number 2, put off envy and cultivate contentment. Some of you need to go out and get Jeremiah Burroughs' book, The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment. That's maybe the best takeaway from this. Contentment is so important for cultivating relationships. Put off envy, put on contentment. Number 3, put off selfishness, that self-centeredness that blinds you to the bigger picture of life, and instead put on servanthood. Realize that you work and you live for the good of others, to bring blessing and benefit to everyone who comes across your path. And number 4, put off fickleness, put on loyalty. Put on loyalty. Ultimately, in closing, a statement by C.S. Lewis, who said this: if you look at yourself, you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But if we look to Christ and you find him, you will find everything thrown in. Let's pray. Father, we are grateful to have this evening together. Grateful for your word, which explains in such vivid details the realities that we know are true around us. And we pray that as we have been confronted and convicted over Solomon's observations and exhortations, that you would take these words and impress them deeply upon our hearts. We pray, Father, that you would make us men of community, men of companionship, and that even as we go from this place into the world, there would be this awe among unbelievers who would say, wow, look at how they love each other. Look at how they love me. Father, make that our ambition, and we ask this so that your name would be glorified. We do so in the name of Jesus. Amen.